Hello and welcome. Apologies for running late. Both Felicity and I have come straight from Create New South Wales Literature Board meeting in the city, and trains weren't going anywhere, and so apologies that you had to wait. Welcome to this SAMAG event, and my name's Michael Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of Westwords, and we are co-hosting this evening. Westwords, for those of you who don't know, is our tagline, explains it all. We are Western Sydney's literature development organisation, which means that we develop the stories of Western Sydney. And we do that through developing the writers, through workshops, masterclasses, residencies, and those kinds of things. We develop the art form through innovative partnerships with other technologies and the interspace between the different cultural traditions of Western Sydney. And we develop the audiences for those stories. And we do that from people about this big to people about my sort of size. But we do have a very strong strategic focus on the next generations coming through. And we see that it's incredibly important when we look to Western Sydney, which is one of the most fastest growing and diverse regions in Australia. Because that is the focus of tonight. The focus of tonight is about the stories and the literary cultures of Western Sydney. And we have on the panel some very exciting, very accomplished writers who will be talking to that. How this evening will work is that once I get off, you'll be hearing from the writings of all four writers and storytellers, just as an introduction to that diversity. And then I'll be handing over to Felicity Castagna, who will be chairing a panel discussion. But first, we'll listen to some of that writing. And I'll introduce you to each of our writers in turn. We'll start with Aisha. Aisha is a political science student of Fijian Indian descent, and she's particularly, her work and her practice is primarily in spoken word poetry, but she's been published in a number of books and magazines. She's featured in major writers' festivals, including Sydney Writers' Festival. Would you please welcome Aisha?
So, a brief introductory before I perform this. Usually I don't like to introduce a poem before I do it. I like to give the audience a mind of its own, but I think it's kind of necessary for me to introduce it. So I wrote this poem late last year when Fraser Anning had made some comments about boys from Western Sydney being like pizza boys and making just all sort of hideous comments about the Muslim community as well. And I thought, I'm a poet. I want to do something productive with this kind of energy. And I wrote an open letter to him titled like Western Sydney. And in this imaginary world where I write this letter, I would send it to him, but I have no backbone and no actual spine. So I didn't send it to him, obviously, but I thought if I write it and I manifest it into the universe, hopefully it gets somewhere. And thankfully it got me into certain rooms that I wouldn't have been before, good rooms. And that's what I'll be performing for you today. I think I want to sit down. I think I want to have a calmer, it seems like a calmer energy. I'm not going to yell at you guys. An open letter to Fraser Anning, Western Sydney. We are diamonds in the diaspora, beautiful and getting older. You know that you can't ignore us. You know all the hurt we've shouldered. Our parents came from overseas, and now we're here under siege. All they did was chase their dreams. All they got were your damn screams. Can you see how much they bleed inside this belly of the beast? They say equality is how far you can reach, but you stole the stool straight from our feet. This immigrant body, Kashmiri, Hindi, Arabi is not your story. We transcend your narratives with our eloquence and excellence. We are the exodus. So hear my voice and hear my hunger. I've awakened from my slumber. My sisters sacrifice their skin with their service. My brothers bend over backwards with purpose. My people created the algebra in your curriculum. Our surgical instruments are in your facilities. Our poetry on your walls and on your bed sheets. Our miswak on your teeth. We are the dessert on your 3-course meal, and eat that all up because, hey, we created that too. And while I argue inventions to people with no ideals, I wonder how we are just reduced to trophies on your business deals, only worthy when we are inspirations, and not when we are ordinary citizens. Like our existence is conditional upon our brilliance. But you say Wogs and Muslims tore up neighborhoods, but white man tore up continents. So please don't use our condiments when you can't pronounce our consonants. For we are diamonds in a diaspora, gorgeous in our grandiose aura, spreading knowledge in our performance, and you will never, ever ignore us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. She was, of course, got the winning title in the 2018 Bankstown Poetry Slam, which is Australia's largest poetry slam. And just as the writing of Western Sydney is as diverse as it comes, it also, the writers practice their writing in very many different forms, and she's written for 2 films with Amnesty International. Next up, Sunil Badami, writer, academic, performer and broadcaster. He has written for many of the publications, including things like Sydney Morning Herald, The Monthly, Australian Literary Review, Southerly, Meanjin, and Australian Gourmet Traveller. And he's published both here in Australia and overseas. And he's going to be reading from one of his essays.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, this is an essay I wrote for Campbelltown Art Centre a little while back, a few years ago, for their exhibition Edge of Elsewhere. And it's interesting because I remember being introduced at an event involving Western Sydney riders, and I was told I wasn't really a Western Sydney rider because I lived in Rozelle, where I and the lady who runs the Thai restaurant on Darling Street are the 0.0000000000001% racial diversity between Nelson Street and Victoria Road. Local colour, that's what they call me. But it is interesting too because I'm often told, people often ask me, you know, where I'm from, and in the same way that I may sometimes say that I am Indian or of Indian descent, I remember being reassured by someone that I wasn't really that Indian. So it's funny because when people from overseas ask me where I'm from, I naturally say Australia. And when people from interstate ask me where I'm from, I say Sydney. And when people in Sydney ask, I say Blacktown, and they look askance as if to say, where the bloody hell is that? For some, the western suburbs are some kind of bloody hell, beginning somewhere around Annandale, blurring into a distant blank space, a no man's land of strange terrors and cultural desolation that evaporates into Emu Plains. A faraway Bougainville, with no atmosphere, no culture, and definitely no reason to visit. A place to leave rather than to return to. A place from which to seek asylum. Unlike the starving colonists of old Sydney town who looked westwards for salvation and installed a governor in Parramatta Park up the road, it seems, at least in the media, nobody looks west. Least of all, many of us who grew up here. I have to say I left as soon as I could, moving to town where I imagined everything happened, and finding myself apologetically justifying my place there by doing everything I could not to appear a Westie, even if I was still obviously a a darkie. But for those who've never ventured any further down Parramatta Road past Annandale, present company accepted, the western suburbs is a kind of uncharted territory. You know, horrified Northern Beaches faces seem to ask, how could anyone want to live there? There's a danger in perpetuating that false perception of us and them, or east and west, that we see in a lot of public discourse today, when, as legendary Granville chicken shop Aljana has just proved by parting the so-called chicken curtain, the borders are always shifting and easily crossed, as long as it takes to get on a train, Michael and Felicity, or given Western Sydney's unending public transport woes, just getting on the motorway. Or more importantly, perhaps, those borders are shifting within us. But it seems odd that most of the city's population, coming from the western suburbs, the city's demographic heartland, must make the effort to engage, at least culturally, with thousands of us spending hours on the train or motorway to line the harbour and crowd the Domain every January for the Sydney Festival, as if there was nowhere else to go. When, while the road ends at the foreshore, there are countless directions heading the other way, going west into Australia's dark heart. But for native Westies, like my mum, living in the western suburbs isn't simply a question of affordability, but of community. The ethnic ghettos pilloried by those opposed to diversity exist only as new immigrants find their feet among friends in a strange land. It seems that the transformation in public opinion from ethnic ghetto to celebrated cultural precincts like Norton Street or Dixon Street only takes a generation, even if in Sydney traffic it sometimes feels as if it's a world away, another country, as foreign as the past, in these forgotten places where everything seems demolished, where certainties seem erased. But it's in those places, like the meaning hidden in the spaces between words, where just as much, if not more, is gained in the translation as was ever imagined lost.
One of those people from or live and work in Western cities, it start to get a little bit perhaps tired of these, but I do love a good stat. And just to kind of put this in some degree of context, Western Sydney population, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 11 Australians live here. That's almost a tenth of Australia's population, which is extraordinary when you kind of refer that back off the sort of, notions of ghettos and, it's not part of us and, down Parramatta Road and Alley and 4 is such another world away. It's got over half the world's populations represented here. And that means all their cultures and cultural traditions and literary traditions kind of coming together and butting up each other and borrowing from each other and learning from each other and into this world of waves of new immigration and new stories. What is coming is probably the most exciting part of the Australian story. And that is what it is we are on the forefront, which I think we are on the forefront of a new literature, a new Australian literature, which is coming out of this place. And that's happening over the past 5 years or so. It's a wonderful place to be in, a wonderful place to partake in those stories. And of course, next up, Troy Bond. Troy, he proudly born and raised in Western Sydney. He has that on his bio, which is why I can say it. And he held the Parramatta Poetry Slam and then on to the Granville Poetry Slam as host and creative director, and was a national finalist in the 2015 Australian Poetry Slam, which is just been happening. But he's also been published in some of Australia's most literary journals of the highest reputation. Troy.
Yeah. I'm going to do a poem from a time in my writing where I had really stopped writing slam poetry, but I hadn't realized that yet. So I still saw myself as a slam poet. So it's an old love poem from a time I was living in Granville. I didn't want to write a love poem using other people's metaphors. I wanted to write a love poem using the details and the minutiae and the metaphors of the place that I lived in and of my real experience. There's a bit of a musical element to it at the top and bottom. I hope that's okay. Credit for the music and lyrics to a good friend of mine, Miles Elkington, but the spoken words in the middle are mine. You were the one that I already knew. Eyes closed, you're humming to your favorite tune. Don't know the words, but I'll sing them for you. It's when two become one. Send me a cute picture of you. Just this. One moment of yourself for safekeeping. Give me a second to find the words, and I promise I'll pay you back. Okay. Give me Moscato from the bottle's lip. On my balcony, in the middle of the night, give me the poem your breath spells out when you sleep, and the firmament you caught beneath your eyelid in the harbor. Let's steal water from fig trees. Let's climb the opera house steps and take turns to share ourselves until we become two books butterflied into each other, a lasagna of cheesy sentences in my bed. I want to lie here until the sun tops out of the sky and time escapes the wristwatch you lost last autumn. I want to kiss you in the nothings between each nervous tick. I want to close the space between our hands and circle you 60 times before you can even catch your breath. How many ways can I say, I love you, before our time is up? How many times did we dance around the words before we finally let them bloom out of us? Sometimes when I try to say what you mean to me, I say, can we do it in the butt instead? These nights I say everything wrong again, and my mouth is a nest of vipers. These nights I spit venom, and I'm good at it too. Forgive me what you can, and give me time for what you can't. Teach me how to apologize a wine stain out of a white shirt, and I will sorry my tongue to scarlet and sound off until my street flashes red and blue in the flare of Granville cop cars responding to my call. I promise. Even if all the exiles in us are 150 shirtless men punching on in a petrol station melee, we will scoop them up and give them something warm to wear. Your capacity for love is far greater than what you make it out to be, and I have grown too many green things to let all this between us not be coaxed to flowering too. Hey, I wrote a play, and it's called Us. I think it goes for like 2 years or 80. Let's go see it together. Just promise me you'll give me your hand again in the upstairs theater if I cry. You were the one that I already loved. We make mistakes, but we come back as one. Look after me while I look after you. It's when two become one.
And now Felicity Castagna, she has been shortlisted or been awarded some of Australia's top literary awards. She's an academic. She supports the community of writing here in Western Sydney. For many years she's run a storytelling evening at Parramatta Artist Studios. A lot of the story of Western Sydney has intersected with Felicity at some point or other in its literary traditions. Felicity.
Thank you. I'm mostly a fiction writer, but I'm going to read a short excerpt from an essay that I wrote for the Sydney Review of Books on Western Sydney literature called Hopefully the Future is Dark. Because I feel like it leads into a lot of the issues I'd like to discuss today about the complexities of literature in this area. Some people say West like it is something wrong, like ice cream that fell in a gutter. I think West is like my brother's music, too much bass so you end up dancing like your body parts don't fit together and laughing all at the same time. That's what West is, shiny cars and loud things, people coming, people going movement. Those who don't know any better, they come into the neighbourhood and lock their windows and drive on through, never stopping before they get somewhere else. These are the first few lines of my second book, The Incredible Here and Now. I can't say that I like them very much. I don't think they work. The rhythm is great, some of the images too, but really what blows the whole thing is that it's too restrictive, too reductive an image of what Western Sydney is to be that useful. The problem is that Western Sydney is a place, but it is also an idea. You can either try to write to that idea, like think Struggle Street or Housos or the combination, every protest you've ever seen on the rooftop of Villawood Detention Centre, every dole bludger you've ever seen on a current affair, or you can write against it. I did both in that passage from my book, in case you didn't notice. Here's another problem, though. You're always going to be writing with or against an image that is already too simplistic. All it does is turn you around and around in circles, replicating stories that can't break out of what the news media does, which is to play to a desire to make certain what is uncertain, to know what is unknowable. What that kind of work does is, in Rebecca Solnit's words, to turn the flight across the sky into the roast upon a plate, to classify, to contain. When literature from Western Sydney finally started to become a thing, or as Geordie Williamson claimed in 2013, emerged as a special kind of shock, as though a Madagascar-sized island suddenly emerged off Sydney heads, a new generation of writers began the important and political work of filling out the spaces of the previous unknown. I was one of them. I think it's fair to say that no one, especially me, knew what we were doing or what the consequences might be. One of the problems I now realise is that books are beautiful, esoteric things, but they are also marketable commodities, and marketing as its essence is a way of flattening deeply complex and contradictory worlds into a simple storyline. It means that discussions of many of the works from Western Sydney end up with incongruous headlines such as Life Flares in Suburban Void for Luke Carman's experimental and poetic novel An Elegant Young Man. Or there's the proliferation of panels on Western Sydney writing at writers' festivals, a move that both indicates that we are part of the mainstream but also emphasises that we are not all at the same time. This is not to say that writers don't participate in the promotion of our work that plays up to stereotypes of Western suburbia. We certainly do. I do. But part of the issue is that it can be difficult to escape, and even more difficult to insist on more complex readings of your work that aren't framed by the known images of this place. Thank you. So I wanted to start with this idea of what is a Western Sydney story? Is trying to categorise it even useful, or is it incredibly useful to say that, well, we kind of have our own aesthetic out here, we have our own different way of storytelling, we certainly have more diverse stories than I think elsewhere in both Sydney and in wider Australia. What do we do with this category of Western Sydney stories? Is it useful? Is it not? What does it mean? What does it mean to you? Who can I throw that out to begin with?
I'm happy to have a go.
Yeah.
I think of myself as a Western Sydney writer, and I happen to live in Maryland in Western Sydney at the moment, but I think I would consider myself a Western Sydney writer even if I ever moved further east. I consider the poem that I did at the start to be a Western Sydney inspired poem, a poem that's from Western Sydney. even though there were only a couple references to real places in Western Sydney. And I think of my poems that have nothing to do with Western Sydney to be in and of that place as well. It's something that shapes me and has shaped me. Simply growing up in Blacktown, living in Granville, now living in Marylands. So even when I'm not writing explicitly about that and putting the spotlight on the Western Sydney-ness of whatever I'm tackling, I think because it is a product that is of me, it does have that kind of fingerprint on it, whatever that might be. And growing up as a Western Sydney person, I'm a first generation child of migrants from Singapore. I always saw myself as someone who was on the outer, who wasn't part of what was considered normal or mainstream culturally. And I think that's a position that I take myself, that I see myself through, even in my practice now, these days. So it's, for me, something that I can't avoid.
Great. I think you've really spoken well about how, like, being a Western Sydney writer is a very, that so many of the storytellers widely in this area are so rooted in this place and so rooted in what it means to be from this place, but are also have such complex and different ways of seeing this space, as I think both of you spoke to very well in your writing.
Well, I'm kind of reminded of Christos Cholkas talking about the slap, and he talked about how, you know, where people often think that ethnic writers are concerned with race, that Australia doesn't have as much of a problem with race as it does with class. And I think there's always been a kind of apology from people who come from Western Sydney that they come from Western Sydney. And I think that's based a lot on the fact that it is pretty much the place where everybody goes when they first arrive. You know, it is the most ethnically diverse part of Australia, if not probably the Southern Hemisphere, I reckon. And I think that especially when my family came to Australia in the 70s, you know, just in the long shadow of the White Australia policy, where multiculturalism was not even really a word and you were expected to assimilate, that you did apologise for, you did try as hard as you could to be Australian, but you were always reminded that you weren't quite ever going to be. And I see a lot of that, I think, in the presumptive kind of discourse, particularly in politics and the media, in which people who've never been to Western Sydney presume to speak for people from Western Sydney, and so they are miscast as Bogans or Howard's battlers or One Nation supporters, when in fact all you have to do is walk down Church Street and you can see there is no sense of us and them, because it's like Filipino people married to Lebanese people. You know, everybody, there's no sense that there's any kind of distinction. I think it's really interesting, going back to what you were saying, Felicity, about the idea of the commodification of authenticity. And I'm reminded of something that Alexis Wright once said, in which she talked about the way that many Aboriginal and ethnic writers are forced into performative demonstrations of their ethnicity or their authenticity, when in fact authenticity is a condition imposed upon us by those in the least position to judge, as she said. And so it is a danger, I think, that people write, you know, the kind of grungy Western Sydney story that kind of plays up to those expectations of what Western Sydney should be. And I really thought, you know, your comment about the idea of Western Sydney reverberates wider. If you look at Australia, Australia is not a collection of place names or demographics or sovereign borders. It's an idea. In fact, it's 25 or 26 million different ideas. And those ideas bounce against each other. They intersect on occasion. They coalesce around something that we can't necessarily and don't often always know how to articulate. In fact, I think Australianness, especially around Anzac Day and Australia Day, is more often articulated in terms of what it is not. That terrible word, that John Howard-esque word, un-Australian, in which we can say exactly what it means to be un-Australian, when what we really mean is it's just not like me. And so I think what is really interesting about the phenomenon of, if we were to say there was a kind of Western Sydney type of writing, it's the fact that it's the kind of stories that we don't see on TV. David Foster Wallace talked about in his great essay, E Unus Pluribus, about fiction in the age of TV, that we write, when we read a book, we project ourselves into the book. We imagine the characters, we imagine the rooms. But when we watch TV, it's projected upon us. And for many of us, for a long time, we were never quite blonde enough or thin enough or, whatever enough. And I think going back to what Troy was saying about the idea of being on the outside, about the idea of being marginal or speaking from the margins, to quote Rebecca Solnit, the wonderful Rebecca Solnit, who said that obliviousness is the deficit of privilege. She talked about how great writing is a kind of solitude shared by us, the writer and the reader, alone but together. And I think those of us who have that sense of always being reminded that we are not quite Australian enough, not quite Sydney-sider enough, not quite enough, we are constantly aware of those, what Toni Morrison called those feelings of tone. And so I think I'm really grateful. In the past, I was ashamed of being a Westie. I was kind of apologetic for being an Indian. But as I get older, I feel grateful. I feel grateful for that because, let's face it, when we read, reading reminds us that we aren't alone, even if we are reading about someone who reminds us that we are alone. But we're all alone together.
Yeah, so I think the idea that there's a Western Sydney voice, even like not defining it arbitrarily, I think the personal is political. So no matter what I write, if I write about loneliness or sadness or love, it's going to be inherently informed by where I've come from, even if it's not directly about it. So I think, and this is probably because I'm just emerging as a writer, I'm struggling with this concept of constantly informing people about my identity but not really wanting to write about my identity because that's not the only thing that's going through my brain. I'm not walking around being like, I'm Indian, that's not my thought process. So why am I forced to write about it? Purely because I need to inform people about it. But then, I've forgotten that if you're being authentic and if you're writing purely from what you've experienced, it doesn't matter. The label's very arbitrary. I think what Sunil said and what Troy said resonates with me so deeply in terms of being performative and feeling marginal. And I've recently started working in the city, and my concept of the only person who looks like me when I go in the city, in my workplace especially. And it's difficult because I'm very aware and I don't want to play into a stereotype. So I'm stuck in my head being like, can I be as white as it can be? Like, I'll talk like them, I'll look like them, I'll speak like them, but I'll never actually be like them. And I think it's just with time and age and maturity and wisdom, I'm sure I'm going to get out of that and not be performative or not try to constantly be thinking about breaking stereotypes because my life does not revolve around other people's assumptions about me. But yeah.
Thank you. I was trying to think about like the evolution of like Western Sydney storytelling in general, and I was trying to think, like where did it come from? And I was sort of remembering like when I was a really baby writer in this community, that where stories were told were actually in the theatre, right? Like I used to go to, Bankstown Youth Development Services when it was above like a 7-Eleven. And, there were some amazing small plays and storytelling nights. And the same when Information Cultural Exchange was a room in the back of the Workers' Union in Granville. And, there were, women who were creating a whole bunch of digital stories there. And so my first, even as somebody who always wanted to be a book storyteller, I guess, was, through performance in this space. And I feel like one of the things that does distinguish a lot of the storytelling in this community is that I feel, and it's arguable, that storytelling in this community has always had its roots in performance, in oral storytelling, and it's meant that that's kind of morphed and changed into, we've had the incredible dynamic rise of performance poetry, which is not just acknowledged in this community, but, Bankstown Poetry Slam and people from Parramatta Poetry Slam as well. You're invited into all these different spaces, and there's, documentaries about these guys that are like touring internationally. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we finally kind of started to have books come out of this place, like whole books. But I still feel like we've come from we've developed stories from a different place than other communities who are more rooted in English as a first language and who are more rooted in telling stories in those kind of traditional ways. And I'm wondering, where do you guys think Western Sydney literature is going now, or where does it need to go? What do you think kind of marks its... Actually, I think you've spoken a lot to what marks its difference, but where do you see Western Sydney storytelling in all its forms kind of evolving now? Where do you see it going?
Sorry. So I was a chair of a panel at the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Can you guess which one? I was the first non-white person appointed to that panel in 10 years. The previous chair at my first meeting got up and said, "Hello everyone. I know I don't look like a typical ethnic, but I'm hoping to bring a fresh perspective to the prize this year." And I got up and said, "Hi, like her, I don't look like a typical ethnic either, but then who does?" Right? And what was really interesting was that I, even in that short period on the Multicultural Award, happened to see this development in the submissions that we were getting. So a lot of submissions when I first started, and I was only there 3 or 4 years, were generally that kind of happiest refugee, apologia, we're so grateful to be here, Australia's the best country in the world. But what I really loved was the fact that there was this development of a voice which was saying, hey, you know what? What do I have to be grateful for? I'm here. I was born here. My father-in-law, my mother-in-law is ABC, Australian-born Chinese. Her family have been in Australia for 8 generations, since Lambing Flat. My father-in-law's family have been in Australia since the 1900s, but she is always asked where she's really from. And so I think it's really interesting, because I think if I can't predict where Western Sydney writing is going to be. I don't speak for every person in the western suburbs, or let alone those who write, any more than I speak for all the ethnics, right? But having said that, I think what's really interesting, the reason I started writing was because there weren't any stories that I could read about me. Not just about Indians or vaguely, sensitive, alienated boys whose mothers were over... No, sorry, there's a lot of books about that. But I couldn't really read a book or a story about my personal circumstances. This is why I started writing, kind of iterations of that. And I think what's really interesting, like Michael was saying before, is rather than stories coming from the western suburbs being seen as some kind of anthropological specimen in which privileged informants enlighten those of us who may come by because we like the food, about the realities, in the back streets. I'm hoping that more of these kind of stories aren't simply apologias, aren't sort of simply performative demonstrations, but simply assertions. That these aren't Western Sydney stories. These are our stories. And we can see ourselves in those stories, and the stories that are being told, not because there are geographic markers, not because there are ethnic distinctions, in the same way that we see ourselves in Emma Bovary or Pip in Great Expectations, or we see ourselves perhaps in the characters in Peter Pollitt's book, which was a great book. So I'm hoping that there will be more confidence, whatever it becomes, whatever those stories become, they become part of our consciousness in a way that, ironically, in the 1890s and 1900s, Australian stories seem to be all about bushies and swaggies and cockies and, the man from Snowy River. when in fact Australia has always been the most urbanised country in the world, in which more than 80 or 90% of the population has always lived in urban areas, including Banjo Paterson, who wrote The Man from Snowy River. So, as I say, I'm hoping that they become part of our story and the way that they change not just the vernacular, but the conversation or the discussion.
Yeah, I hope our stories are, like Sunil said, normalised, and they're not distinctions. Like I think it was last year or early this year, I was at Sydney Writers Festival. I was with Bankstown Poetry Slam, and I was also wanted to check out any other ethnics that were around the area too, any other panels. And there was just two of us. There was Sweatshop, which is an incredible literacy organisation, and Bankstown Poetry Slam. I made a point to attend both, and what I loved, what they were all self-oriented, self-starting kind of. They were doing an anthology release for Sweatshop, and Bankstown Poetry Slam was purely Bankstown Poetry Slam artists. And yeah, I think it's an addition, but it's not an incorporation. I think that's what I want to see. I don't want to see us being added as, yep, we've got the people from Bankstown, and yep, we've got those other people who look kind of different to us. And they're incredible, and we're so enlightened when we come out of these people. Then, like, we've got so many ideas now, but you're never actually incorporated. Like, I want to sit on a panel with someone who does not, like, in our lineup, for example, is all, not all, but majority, like, hijab wearing, similar ethnic backgrounds. And what can happen when those spaces happen is it becomes an echo chamber, and all we hear in those stories is identity politics. Okay, then another identity politics, because we all under this intense pressure to perform for this huge, the Sydney Writers Festival event that we had was one of the closing events. And it was also free, so it was packed out with people. So all of us are going through being like, we can't do these poems anymore because there's all these people who have no idea what our stories are about. So we're all like, yep, I've got that Bosnia poem, we've got that poem from this country. And these are not the stories that we want to be telling, but the stories we feel like we should be telling. And so, yeah, incorporation, yeah.
Yeah. So I teach in a very multicultural school in a newly suburbanised area in Liverpool. I teach at Good Samaritan Catholic College. And I teach some of, I believe, the best young up-and-coming writers of the next couple of decades. There are some kids there who blow my mind with what they do with words and with performance. These are not kids who typically speak English at home. White kids are the minority at my school. The kids at my school speak Arabic at home, or Vietnamese, or Chaldean, or Italian, etc., etc. My Extension 1 English class has 6 kids of color and 1 Maltese girl who everyone assumes is white, but she's more Maltese culturally. And the work that they're producing is not work that tries to represent Western Sydney, because they live in this bubble that is Liverpool, and the culture of Liverpool and the culture of their homes where mum speaks Arabic is normal to them. So they have this amazing kind of myopic perspective, myopic and short-sighted in a good way, where they're not trying to justify their own existence as a writer of colour. And they're writing love poems that are specific to them, and they're writing poems about loneliness that are specific to them, and coming of age in a way that's specific to them, but not in a way that's performative for an audience that's outside of their bubble. And I would love to see Western Sydney writing head in that direction in the future.
I feel like, we've only got a few more minutes, and I just really feel like it's important because we're here, for SAMAG, which is, for arts professionals, and many of the people in the audience are working for arts organisations, and maybe here today even to kind of try and walk away not just with an understanding of the literature and the voice and the aesthetic of this community, but maybe even like with some solid strategies for like what works and what could be better. I think that we really need to address what are some solid ways that arts organisations can, and literature boards and people who don't even necessarily work in literature, but how can what can organisations do to foster, support, market, promote Western Sydney stories? And, you know, here's the point at which I'd love you as an audience even to, you know, jump in with some of the questions that you might have, because I think it's a really important question to end on, those kind of practicalities.
No, totally. I think you're absolutely right, Felicity. I mean, it is interesting, like you were saying, Aisha. You know, it's not simply a assimilative question of, you know, have you ever had this where people go, "Oh, I don't see colour," yeah, but again, it's only because it's never been an issue, right? And I remember talking to David Malouf, who is famously anti-identity politics, right? And David Malouf, the great Australian writer David Malouf, talked to me about, and he said, you know, we're all multicultural in a way, right? We're all different people in different contexts to different people. I'm different to my wife, to my children, to the police when they pull me over, right? I'm different to my students, etc. But nobody ever talks about David Malouf being the great gay Lebanese Australian writer David Malouf, but we are all kind of prefixed with woman writer, or, you know, Fijian, Indian, Muslim, Australian writer, or Indian, Australian writer, blah, blah, blah. And so I do hope that, but having said that, we do have to have those just really important discussions about how to change those structural inequalities, right? And the problem is like you were saying before, we privilege literature and the literary over the performative. We privilege it because it is a bourgeois pursuit. Fiction has always been a bourgeois pursuit, right? But the fact is I've been to a lot. I get people from Create New South Wales. I had someone from Create New South Wales last year ring me up and say, "Oh, hey, Snell, I was really wanting to talk to you." And I said, "Oh, yeah, why is that?" And they said, "Oh, because there's this panel I think you'd be great for." And I said, "Oh, yeah, what's it about?" And she said, "Oh, well, it's about diversity." I said, "Okay, hey, have you Googled me?" And she said, "No." I said, "Well, because if you did, you would see I do a lot of different things. But one of the things I don't do is basically sit in front of a room of well-meaning white people telling them how hard it is to be my colour for an hour, right?" And of course she said, "Oh, I didn't mean to sound like an arsehole." I said, "Who does? Who does?" But the point is we keep having these conversations. We keep having these panels at Writers' Festival. We keep having these panels, and we keep talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. But the thing is how are you going to improve Western Sydney representation structurally if you don't have people from Western Sydney, not in a kind of let's tick that box kind of way, in higher echelons, on funding boards, on, not just in terms of being appointed to a board for 1 or 2 years, but within management itself. Like what often happens in corporate and organisational cultures is that they self-replicate. So you see organisations and basically everybody at the top hires people like themselves. And that's fine, but there's no point keep continuing to have these discussions if nothing is going to get done beyond those kind of, let's do a little bit of an event, let's do a little bit of a scholarship or some funding here or there. It actually has to go right down into the, branch and root, so to speak, and right from the very top. But I don't know how we'll do it, because unfortunately literature is not as sexy as it used to be in the 18th century. It's all reality TV now. They're very diverse. Love Island.
Confirm that, having come from a meeting about it today. Yeah, so what would you like to say?
I'm a writer in the capacity that I am today because of 2 women, my peers. Their names are Rapunzel Espiritu and Rachel Kalea. And Rapunzel and Rachel started Parramatta Poetry Slam years ago. I think it was 2012. They wanted to start Blacktown Poetry Slam, but there was no Blacktown venue that would take them. It was too expensive. They'd have to pay someone to staff the venue. It was after hours, this and that. So the furthest west they could go was Parramatta, and it wasn't a performing arts venue necessarily that took them in. It was the Mars Hill Cafe on Church Street. So it was called Mars Hill Slam, and it's not there anymore. But Rapunzel and Rachel are two women who grew up in the western suburbs. They grew up in Mount Druitt. They went to school at St. Mary's. And they have a passion for the area. So they wanted to start something as far west as they could go. But Parramatta was as far west as they could go. In a very small way, and I felt this kind of frustration and desperation as well, later becoming a slam organizer and taking Parramatta Poetry Slam on. It's hard to find a good venue out west. And I know the situation these days is much better, or somewhat better. There are more venues opening up. But for the performing arts, at least, we just need venues. We need venues that'll take us, that people, that charge reasonable, rates, and that are nice, that have a nice vibe that people will want to attend because it's cool. And that kind of thing exists in abundance the further east you go, but it doesn't exist in the west. Not enough yet.
And look how much infrastructure there is. I mean, the only reason we've got that Western Sydney got $20 million 3 years ago was because it was a condition of James Packer getting unsolicited approval for the Barangaroo Casino and the fact that he was building a big block of flats on Macquarie Street. So it's really outrageous when you consider they're spending over $1 billion on the extension to the art gallery, and they were planning on paving the ocean between Wharf 2, 3 and 4, 5. We can't get enough venues. You know, the oldest pub in Parramatta got demolished for the sake of the light rail, which they don't even know they're going to complete now.
Do you have a last comment?
Yeah, I think Troy's very right. There's a lack of venues, a lack of, I think, family-friendly venues. If you're going to do something in Western Sydney, for Western Sydney, you have to understand how Western Sydneyers operate. There's certain spaces where I don't like to go to. It's just not my cup of tea. And people, and this is not me being, like, not all Muslims are homogenous, but a lot of the people from my background will not enter certain venues. But if you want to cater for everyone, if you want to be of this space, you have to accommodate for this space. So that is taking into account the socioeconomic, the cultural, all that kind of stuff, like be for the people, by the people kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I, because I know, we started late and we're ending late, but I would love to hear, are there any questions from the audience? I think particularly, those ones on a practical level. Are there questions from those people who are running organisations, have lots of money, want to know where to spend it?
I don't know if anyone can actually answer this, but I want to know how we can be inclusive and incorporating Western Sydney without seeming tokenistic. Because I feel like you don't want to just have that one person of colour or that one Muslim on the panel, but at the same time you don't want to have a whole panel of Muslims or ethnic people, and then because that's almost like saying you're over there and we're over here. So how do you make it so it's almost like half or a good mix, I guess, without being tokenistic?
I think it goes to what Sunil was saying about people entering upper echelons. So I think the more the upper ups change and there's more people of diversity throughout the spectrum as we go along in the management cycle. The more it doesn't matter if there's one Muslim person or no Muslim person in that panel, the discussion will always be open, I guess. I think for me it's been really important, even though I'm still an emerging writer, if I have a space that I don't need to be there, I'll let someone else, a person of colour or someone I can support, get into that door. So I find that in different kinds of communities, people go into the door, they shut it, they're like, bye-bye, I'm part of this group now, I've made it, that's it. Whereas the most incredible people, Sarah Mansour, Sarah Saleh, these people who have informed me and have just done incredible things for me, purely because they take you up as they go up. And that's the kind of attitude we want to have in organisations as well.
Some of the organisations, like, SAMAG, for example, we're all like on the committee in a voluntary capacity, aside from Sasha, who's running it. But aside from money, which of course should probably be number one thing, how do we get you to want to come back? Like for more work, like repeat work with arts organisations?
Like, how do we get people from Western Sydney to like actually use the services that are out there and frequent the services and come back and feel comfortable and blah 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 blah? Yes, good question. Does anyone? Troy, do you want to? No.
I think the more effective a service is, the more someone will come back to it. If I see that a conversation has been productive, of course I'm going to go back into that conversation. If I see a conversation hasn't been productive, then I will not go back to that conversation. And also, if I feel like I'm the only person in this room who looks like me, then I'm more likely not going to want to come back. But if I come back and because someone's heard this, they're more likely to. Because I think, for example, if I saw my friend go into a poetry slam, I'm more likely to go to that poetry slam if she's had a good experience. So it's all word of mouth, I think, nowadays, especially with us young people.
I mean, I think of, say, someone like Lena Nalhus at Diversity Arts Australia, right? Like, she's really very committed and very passionate about what she does. And I think that the fact that people can see that she understands what it's like to not necessarily... See, here's the thing, right? Like, the idea of privilege, and we see it a lot in discourse at the moment, right? Public and political and media discourse, is the idea that a lot of people consider their privilege to be their right. But privilege is actually a responsibility. And if you are not sharing your privilege, then you don't deserve to have it. And so I think the big thing is, it's like that idea, when we go back to multiculturalism, the idea of tolerance. You know what? I tolerate my children's music. It doesn't mean I like it, right? And I think there's a difference between tolerance and celebration or acceptance. And I think it's the same in terms of arts organisations. Like, let's face it, the road to Emu Plains is paved with good intentions. But having said that, the point is that it's not about permission, right? I think that's the problem, is that often people, when they're thinking about doors being opened or looking for grants or trying to get a spot or support, it's about patronage. You know, when I was working at Arts New South Wales, I remember a very infamous art manager, program manager said, "Oh, we're like the De Medicis." And I went, yeah, but with other people's money, right? So it shouldn't be a sense that there are gatekeepers. I think that's what's really amazing about the kind of arts that you guys are doing and that you're talking about, Troy and Felicity and Aisha, is that it's participatory. You know, it's people saying, you know what, fuck it. We're not going to get, anyone else is not going to give us that venue. They're not going to give us this funding. We'll just do it ourselves. But it's always stacked against that kind... And when you look at culture, when you look at language, right? Think about how the world's greatest lexicographers and linguists came together and said, why don't we create a language that everyone can speak? Do you know anyone who speaks Esperanto? Whereas English, this complicated, convoluted, contradictory language, it gets picked up and becomes not just Creole or patois, but it becomes slang and lingo, and it becomes a code, and we know by its accents and its rhythms where it comes from. And I hope that that's how Western Sydney stories will speak, not because they definitively or performatively say this is where I'm from and this is where my parents came from, but we will know it sounds like Western Sydney writing, Western Sydney poetry. I think the big problem, though, is that, like English, it can't be dictated to us from the top. And as long as opera or ballet or those big majors, and don't get me wrong, I mean, you know, they have their place, but the fact is why do they get so much more funding whenever you go into a Create New South Wales Arts Board meeting or Australia Council meeting? They will often say, we'll give it to a big major rather than 100 little kind of by the seat of their pants, we're just going to try this out somewhere in Campbelltown. I think there is a kind of resume bias which says, oh, you know, I don't know. And I've been in those meetings. So it has to come from the bottom.
Okay, I'm going to end with one last quick comment, which is just give us professional outcomes and we'll come back. It's not good enough to value our stories. It's not good enough to celebrate our stories. Give us professional outcomes, fund us to do professional work, to publish professional books, give us the level of skills to become editors, to run arts organisations, to publish award-winning books and run amazing poetry slams. So we're going to end right there. I know we're way over time. I'm pretty sure there's some drinks and some food there, and all of us would love to talk to you more. So come and have a drink, something to eat, and thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience.
Finish. Thank you, you four. Thank you so much. But also thank you for SAMAG for this event, and also the University of New England for providing us the venue and allowing us to gather. Thank you.
Thank you.